Hi, my name is Leah Huynh. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and this is my dog Martha. She just wanted to join us for today. And today we're going to talk about dysfunctional Asian family generational trauma. And so I wanted to bring this up because I feel like a lot of my Asian American clients, they feel like there's something that they're feeling, but they don't have permission to really talk about it because they don't want to dishonor their parents. And I can understand that, right? Because we are often taught that we need to respect our elders, respect our parents, we need to listen to them and obey them. And I think that's a great thing. I think there are times though that can be detrimental, and that's when maybe you are feeling something that your parents did and you're not allowed to express that. You're keeping that inside, you're questioning it, you're confused, and you're just overall stuck. So this video is not meant to bash anyone at all. I don't want to bash any parents because as a parent myself, I know that we're all trying to do our best, and boy, do we mess up. But I do want this to be a time where you can feel validated for what you went through and maybe open up something inside of you, maybe with a trusted friend, maybe with a therapist, maybe, a pastor at your church, and really get some healing done. So the other thing I want to say is not all Asian, I don't want this to be a stereotype thing. I don't want this to be like, oh, all Asian families are like this, because all families are different. Some are very healthy, others have more dysfunction, oftentimes because they had dysfunction growing up as well. So it is like a generational thing. I just want to say that not all families are this way. Okay, so without further ado, let's dive in. So the great thing about Asian families is that we are taught to really love the family, and there's a big sense of sacrifice, right? I mean, a lot of times you hear about people, leaving their jobs in China. They were doctors and they came here for the kids, right? To have a better life, to have a better future. And there's a lot of emphasis on hard work, on sacrifice. And so I think that's a great thing. I think the hard part is where you have parents who find all of their identity in caring for their children, right? And so what happens is they end up doing things for kids that they don't need. So like way past the age of when they could do it themselves. I understand needing to do things for kids when they're younger, but they're like in their 20s and 30s and parents are doing their laundry and they're coming in and cleaning their rooms. And a lot of times these adult children are saying, I'm really angry. Now granted, maybe these adult children aren't the most organized. They don't, they're really messy. And so I think that maybe the parents get frustrated. But the solution that they take is to go into their room and clean their room and, read their journals and just find all kinds of things that maybe the adult children weren't happy about, right? So that's one thing, just like the basic, day-to-day household, if an adult child is living with an Asian parent. So another way that Asian families oftentimes don't have good boundaries is when they really coerce the children to stay at home when they really should be going out and being independent. Now, I'm not bashing on people that stay at home. I lived at home until I got married. Maybe the adult child really wants to leave. Maybe they want to find work in another state or another country, or maybe they want to just live and be on their own. And sometimes the parents will look down on that and say, oh, you're wasting money, or, this and that. At the end of the day, sometimes parents, they just want their kids to be close, which again is not bad, but I think there's a way that the kids get stunted in their growth because they're not allowed, or it's not encouraged for them to go out and be on their own, especially if that's something that they want to do. Or maybe they feel so comfortable because their parents do everything for them that they just end up being at home and they have the failure to launch syndrome, right? Where they don't go out, they don't have any motivation to do anything because everything is provided for them at home. The other thing I see is Asian parents not letting adult children make their own choices. So they might not be happy about their choice of spouse or their religion or their job or something like that. And there's sort of this control. I once knew somebody whose father said, you have to go into healthcare or else I'm going to disown you. So I think there's a way in which Asian parents feel like they, maybe because that's the way they were with their parents, that they're owed obedience, even in terms of what they do for the future. I've seen people get disowned because they didn't choose a certain spouse that maybe had a certain job or a certain status or education. I understand as a parent, it's very, very anxiety provoking, but I think, and I'll get into that later, but I think the boundary crossing is where you don't allow your kids to make those decisions, or you manipulate them or guilt trip them into doing what you want. versus letting them live and letting them learn on their own, or letting them sort of make their own choices. The other thing that I see is giving unsolicited advice, right? So telling kids what they should do, especially when raising kids, telling them how they should raise their kids, giving them unsolicited advice, when the adult children are clearly saying, we don't need that advice, we already know what we want to do, we've already talked to our doctor. And there's a way, I think, again, that your parents may have heard that from their parents and they have to just receive it. I think for this generation, it feels judgmental. It feels like the parents don't trust you. And so I think there's a difference between giving a suggestion, making a judgment, or giving advice when it's not warranted, especially if it's not a safety issue or something that's going to really hurt you or the child. And another thing that I see is when a parent will make their child like a surrogate spouse. So maybe the parent is not close to their spouse, and so they turn to their kids to be, their listening ear, to the one that they can count on, the one that they complain to about their spouse. And that is a boundary that is not appropriate for a child, right? Because that is not something that can handle. It's a lot of power, and it puts a lot of pressure on the child to take sides, and it pits the other parent against the child, right? So it's very confusing, and it can be very damaging. As a child, oftentimes you don't know what's going on. You might just think, oh, like mom or dad are just sharing with me, but it's actually a crossing of boundaries, right? Because your mom or your dad, they should be talking to each other, right? They shouldn't be talking to you. They shouldn't be looking to you for advice. That is too much pressure to put on a child. The next thing I want to talk about, and I talked about this a little bit, is unaddressed anxiety that they put on you as the child, right? So I think for Asians, we're not really taught to be self-aware, to know what we're feeling. We're oftentimes told that feelings are just selfish, or we should just, which I think in some cases is a good thing, but I think in some cases that can also be detrimental, right? Because I think what happens is a lot of Asian parents have anxiety about their kids, right? A lot of times they've come from a different country, immigrated here, started as a dishwasher, very poor. Other times they come from countries where if you don't get into a good school, it's the difference between like becoming a professor or being homeless, right? Like you only have one shot. And so a lot of those anxieties, a lot of that baggage gets brought here and put on the child, right? So a lot of this is like a school pressure. If you don't get like all A's, if you don't get perfect SAT scores, a lot of that gets put on the child, and the child feels this immense pressure to perform. And I talked a little bit too about finding the right spouse, right? A lot of that is anxiety that the parent holds for their children. The other thing that parents often put anxiety on is about money, right? So like spending money, being frugal, like buying a house. Those are things that they feel anxious about. And so they might put a pressure on you like, oh, why are you buying that? Why are you spending so much on this, right? Why don't you let me just cook for you? Like, don't go out to eat. It stems from that sort of that extreme scarcity mindset. I'm not opposed to being frugal. I think that's good. But when it's an extreme scarcity mindset where, it doesn't allow you to go out to eat once in a while, or it's like a penny saved, a pound foolish, or it's just adding extra stress, I think that's where I think it goes into a little bit of the dysfunctional sphere. The next thing that I think that happens a lot in Asian families is not, and I spoke about this earlier, is not being aware of your emotions or feelings and not encouraging the expression of emotions or feelings. And I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing all the time. I think sometimes we just need to get over ourselves and we just need to do something, do the right thing, right? But I think there's a way in which when we can't acknowledge how we're feeling, that it really does impede our growth. A lot of times when I work with Asian families, the older generation, they're so used to stuffing their feelings, they don't even know what they're feeling. And they may do things because they're feeling a certain way, but they can't access what that is. They will maybe deflect it, or they will be in denial about how they feel. They can't really get to an honest place, right? So I think that's where it really hurts the next generation. So the next thing I see is guilt tripping and shaming. And this comes from the value of honoring your parents and obedience. This obligation that people feel towards, this filial piety, right? There's a very heavy emphasis on obligation, right? Again, not feelings, but more an obligation. And so a lot of times the guilt tripping will come out of place of like, I know you don't want to do that, but you should, because I've done all this for you. Like I've come across, like I've left my home country and everything that's comfortable for me so that you can have a better education. And a lot of times parents they'll use that as a way to force kids to spend time with them, force them to love them, force them to listen to them, because I don't think they know any other way to do it is just out of obligation. Do it because you should, because that's what they did, right? They don't understand the reciprocal nature of relationships, earning respect, earning love because you want to love the other person. I think it's just a very different way of thinking about things because of the way that they were raised. But I think that's hard for when you're born in America or you're not born overseas, when you're told that, oh, you should come and visit me or you should love me because I'm your mom or I'm your dad, no matter what I've done to you or no matter how you feel about me, which I think in some sense is true. But I think the guilt and the shame and sort of this obligation can really feel taxing on a person. The next thing I want to talk about is overly concerned with face saving, right? So then this is a problem too, even with mental health, right? It's like, oh, don't go to a therapist. Don't tell anyone outside of our family our problems because we don't want to look bad, right? Or don't share anything with anyone else because we don't want to look bad. Or you need to go to this certain school, you need to have this certain job, marry this certain person because it will look bad. And so a lot of times this strips people of their own personal, like what they feel is best for them, because they always feel like they have to worry about what other people are thinking of them. So they're not living a truly authentic life. And so again, I think in some sense, being mindful of what you share with other people, making sure it's safe, being mindful of the consequences of the choices that you make are good. But if all it is about worrying about what other people want, I think that's where people can feel stifled and they can feel like they're not being authentic. And so I think that just comes from the value to save face for Asian families. The other thing I want to talk about is how Asian families can be highly performance driven and performance can equal love. I've seen some people say like the only time that my parents would ever say anything nice to me is if I brought home straight A's. The only time that I was praised was when I won an award in piano. And I think that can take a toll on a person's self-esteem because you feel like you always have to perform. You feel like you can't make mistakes. You feel like who you are as a person is not good enough. Right? So, you hear about these schools in Palo Alto where the kids have a high suicide rate. A lot of times it's because, well, I didn't get a good grade, or I'm comparing myself to other people. I'm not good enough. And so they feel like, well, if I'm not good enough, then I'm not lovable. And if I'm not lovable, then, well, maybe it can take a very heavy toll on your mental health. Now, I'm not saying that you should just enable people to be, deadbeats and not work hard. But I think that if all your worth is in your performance and that's all that you were praised for, I think that can be really detrimental. Another thing that people like to do that we see a lot in Asian culture is comparing, right? Like, oh, cousin so-and-so, right? He got into Harvard and he opened a homeless shelter and he's found a cure for cancer all at the age of 20, right? Why can't you be like that, right? Or why can't you be like your older sister? Like, she's so good, right? Why can't you be like that? And there could be a box that you get put in. As a good Asian kid, you play piano, you do this, you have good straight A's, you always listen to your parents, and there's no room to be creative. There's no room if you want to be an artist, right? There's no room if maybe you have a different way of thinking, right? There's just a lot of your affirmation is based on fitting into a box. I think also that comes from the culture, right? If you look at sometimes I'll watch these videos of people in China and they have these rows and rows of people doing exercise all together, all in step, all in sync. And a lot of that is the value for conformity and for just looking a certain way, uniform, right? And so I think a lot of times Asian families have a one-track mind of how things should look, right? Like a right and a wrong. There's not a lot of room for things that are different. And that can oftentimes hurt a child that maybe doesn't fit the mold, right? The other thing I want to talk about is authoritarian parenting. So what that is, very harsh, a lot of rules. There might be some verbal abuse, some physical abuse, just sort of I'm the boss and what I say goes. And there's a lack of love, affirmation, and praise. And this happens a lot. I remember, I knew somebody who, she had finally like achieved, like she got her PhD. She was like doing so well in life. Like she was basically perfect. And it took that for her, I think she was in her 30s, for her father to finally say, I'm proud of you. And I remember her telling me that she broke down at the dinner table weeping because she had never heard her dad say anything like that to her in her life, even though she was like a really great kid, right? Like super stellar in everything that she did. She had to be like the perfect person, but for her to hear that made her just like, I don't know, it was beautiful, but also sad at the same time. There's no praise. There's no affirmation, a lot of criticism, a lot of just do what I say and I don't care what you think. And again, sometimes that verbal and physical abuse, like calling people names, stupid, dumb, those kinds of things. So those things can cause a lot of damage, right? So I just want to say, if any of these resonate with you, use this as a time to really process your feelings, to talk to somebody that's supportive, that can really help you open some of this stuff up and get some healing from those things. You may not be able to talk to your parents. Another thing about Asian parents is it's hard for them to admit their faults. And I think this comes from them and their parents, right? They were taught to just obey, right? And not question. And so they oftentimes expect the same thing, right? If you tell them they're wrong, they probably will just, a lot of times, not all, a lot of times they'll just say, oh, it's because of this and that, or you're being too sensitive. It's really hard to talk to Asian parents. But if you're one of the lucky ones, I would say, yeah, maybe this would be helpful for you to share with them. I do see a lot of families in therapy where there's the older generation and the younger generation. And that's really special because most Asian family, older generation, they don't want to seek therapy. So whatever it is, I hope that this was helpful for you. If you want to leave a comment down below, most of the time I will respond, and my website is down below if you want to reach out. Okay, take care.